Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our 5-part series on the Bible as a 5-act play. So far, we've looked at Act 1, creation, talked about the goodness of creation and about humankind's fall in Act 2, or our rejection of God's control of our lives in favor of our own self-determination, which didn't exactly work out as Adam and Eve had hoped, just like it doesn't exactly work out the way that we hope when we do it in our own lives. And the consequences of the fall we saw were all kinds of suffering and cruelty in our world. And now we're on to Act 3, the story of Israel. And you guys, this is so long. This is like the whole Old Testament, Genesis 3, all the way through the end of the Old Testament. So I'm going to try to squeeze it into something of a manageable time frame. And if I leave something out or oversimplify something, please just bear with me, forgive me, be patient. So, God made a covenant with a guy named Abram, who changed his name to Abraham. Following that, name changes are a big thing in the Bible that we don't have time to talk about, but it's a big theme. When something major happens, you change your name. So, God made a covenant with Abraham in Genesis. God promised to make of him a great nation. And then God took God's sweet time following through, about 25 years, the Bible says, between making the promise and the birth of Isaac, the son of the promise. It was quite a test of faith for Abraham. But God was faithful. So Isaac grew up and married Rebekah, and they had twin sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob tricked Isaac into giving him the blessing that was meant for Esau, which was a really big deal back then. If you tricked somebody out of a blessing, it was like serious. And here, the family began a feud that lasted a long time. And Jacob, you might remember, later wrestled with an angel, demanding a blessing from the angel, and getting it, along with a new name, Israel. Jacob had 12 sons, forerunners of what would be the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph was Jacob's favorite because he was the firstborn of Jacob's wife, Rachel. You remember how Jacob wanted to marry Rachel, and his father-in-law tricked him into marrying Leah instead, and he had to work some more so that he could get to marry Rachel, and it's a whole soap opera. Genesis would make great TV, you guys. Anyway, so he finally got Rachel, and a number of his sons were through Leah. Through Rachel, he had Joseph and Benjamin, and she died in childbirth of Benjamin. So Joseph was the favorite. He's the one that got the coat of many colors and all of that jazz. Which of course made all the brothers jealous. They sold Joseph off into slavery in Egypt, which turned out to be fantastic because then there was this huge famine, and Egypt was fine because Joseph had these visions from God, and they avoided famine there. So the whole family ended up coming down to Egypt so that they could not starve. And from there, Israel was now not in Canaan, not in the land that had been promised by God to Abraham. Now they're in Egypt, and this sets up Exodus and everything that comes after. So, a new Pharaoh comes into power in Egypt who doesn't care about Joseph, doesn't know anything about Joseph, doesn't care about his descendants, and that's when the people are enslaved because there are so many of them. They became so numerous, just like God had promised to Abraham. There were tons of them, and they were a threat, so they were enslaved. But eventually Moses comes along, and Moses leads them out of slavery. God parts the Red Sea. You guys have all seen the Charlton Heston thing, so we don't have to go there. They're on their way then, at this point, after they've been freed, to becoming a nation. Now, Israel is not supposed to be like the nations of the world. They're not supposed to have a king. At least that's the way it works at first. The intention is that God will be their king. You know, they have the 10 Commandments that came from God, and those are in the Ark of the Covenant, and there's a little throne on top of the Ark, and they imagined that God really was there dwelling in the Ark, dwelling among them, and that God is their king. And there are prophets, and there are priests, and there are people in power, but there's no king for Israel. But things were pretty chaotic. If you read the book of Judges, like, things are haywire without a king, right? And the people get to a point where they say, we want to be like all the other nations, and God is grieved by this, but God relents, and God gives them a king. Also, I should back up, you also get the beginning of the sacrificial system, coming after the Exodus, right? Like the people sinned, and so they needed to sacrifice an animal, or they needed to sacrifice something to draw near to God. That's actually what sacrifice means, draw near in Hebrew. So that's going on. So now we've got a sacrificial system. We have a people with no king, but they really want a king. So God gives in. And Samuel anoints Saul, who's a kind of good king at first, and then he gets really jealous when David is anointed to be the successor, and he's like really threatened by how amazing David is, and Saul goes basically kind of nuts. David becomes king, and David is a good king, except that he does some pretty bad stuff, like when he commits adultery with Bathsheba and then sends her husband out onto the front lines in battle so that nobody will discover that he's the one that got her pregnant. Yeah, people are complicated, right? So Israel actually only had 3 kings: Saul, David, and then Solomon. And Solomon built the temple, which was good, but he used a lot of forced labor and things to do that, which was bad, right? So it's all a mixed bag. With all of them, mixed bag. And then after that, nobody can agree on who should be king next. So the nation of Israel splits up into a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah. And eventually the northern kingdom fell to the Assyrians in the 8th century BC, and the southern kingdom to the Babylonians a couple hundred years later. Babylonians took people away. The capable people went off into exile, and others stayed and remained conquered back in the homeland. But eventually the people were allowed to return home, and they rebuilt their temple because it had been destroyed. So they rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem upon their return. Why did Israel fall to foreign powers? Well, why did humans fall in the creation story? Because they turned away from worship and obedience to the one true God. So in this case, as people encountered other cultures as they're moving into this land or living alongside other cultures in the land of Canaan, they would turn to worship of foreign gods. Over and over and over again, we would see this. And they were also exploiting the poor and forgetting their responsibilities to care for one another. So the idea is that this is the natural consequence of their denial of God and their denial of God's ways. The natural consequence is that they're going to be taken over by the other powers of the world. And so that's what you see a lot of the prophets coming and warning people to change their ways, because there will be consequences for what they are doing. There's so much here. I mean, I wish I could say so much more, but I'm totally already running out of time. So forgive me for anything I've left out or oversimplified, as I said, but just from this, how does the story of Israel as a nation that grows, that rises, that splinters and then falls and then is redeemed, how does this fit into the whole of the Bible? Well, just to name some things, the people have always been looking for someone to lead them besides God, and it never works out. And eventually, God will send his own son, Jesus, who will be the king the people have longed for, even if he's a different kind of king than they thought they wanted. Also, remember I mentioned sacrifice just briefly back then? People have always had to make sacrifices to atone for the mistakes they've made or to draw near to God, or at least that's what they thought. So God was distant, but the sacrifice was a way of drawing near. They want to be near God the way that we were in the garden. And in Act 4, we'll see how God actually draws near to humans in the incarnation, in the very person of Jesus. In Jesus, God's going to fulfill and abolish the sacrificial system itself, and also fulfill the words of the prophets, fulfill the Hebrew scriptures, while simultaneously drawing in new people, making it not just about one nation, but about everyone being drawn in, so that the story is for all people. And the idea that God's chosen people went into exile, but then were redeemed and brought home, restored to their land, given another chance in God's promised land. I mean, isn't that a little bit of an echo of the bigger story of the garden and the fall and the fact that we'll be restored to that kind of perfect creation in the end, in the New Jerusalem? Okay, what about today? I promise we're almost done, you guys. What about today? What does a story about an ancient nation that didn't even last very long, depending on how you look at it, mean for us now? Well, Jesus opened the way so that this story becomes a story not just for people with Jewish heritage, but a story of all people who believe in the God of Israel. And the story of that nation isn't all sunshine and roses, is it? We see this consistent pattern of turning away from God and yet being restored and forgiven, of losing their way but finding it again with God's help. So this is really a story about God loving us through our own faithlessness, because God himself is always faithful. So faithful that God decided ultimately to do for us what we can't do for ourselves. That's true of the coming of Jesus, which we'll talk about next week, but it's also true on the small scale in our lives every day, isn't it? We make mistakes, but we find our way back to God. And we ask God for things, but God often does for us what we not only can't do for ourselves, but what we wouldn't even know to ask for ourselves. Who would have dreamed up a Messiah that gets crucified? But that's exactly what the people needed. And who would have dreamed up a lot of the things that God has done in our own lives? Not us. But God is faithful, and God guides us and cares for us even better than we could ask or imagine. So more on Jesus and on God's faithfulness next week as we make our way into Act 4. I hope you'll join us.